in a stone scriptorium on the western coast of Ireland, where Atlantic winds carry salt and rain across rolling green hills. A monk named Colman dedicates his days to the meticulous work of manuscript copying. The year is 742, and spring has arrived with gentle persistence, bringing longer daylight hours and the scent of wet earth through the scriptorium's narrow windows. Good evening. I am grateful you are here tonight. Tonight's story will carry us to a medieval Irish scriptorium in the year 742, where we will follow Brother Colman through the quiet rhythms of his copying work. Let yourself settle in, get comfortable, and know that there is nowhere else you need to be. This story will be here, unfolding slowly for as long as you need. Colman was 29 years old, his fingers permanently marked by the oak gall ink that stained them deep brown, his shoulders slightly rounded from years of bending over his work. The scriptorium occupied the second floor of the monastery's stone tower, a space designed to capture the best light while protecting precious manuscripts from the dampness that rose from the ground. 3 other scribes worked at their own desks, but the room maintained a companionable silence broken only by the scratch of quills on vellum and the occasional creak of a wooden stool. The morning had begun as it always did, with the bells calling the community to lauds while darkness still held the world. After prayers and a simple meal of porridge and ale, Colman had climbed the narrow spiral stairs to the scriptorium, carrying with him the bundle of supplies he would need for the day. His movements held an unhurried quality, each step deliberate, each action performed with the same measured attention he brought to every task. Colman's desk stood near the eastern window, positioned to catch the early light that now streamed through the small opening. The wooden surface bore the marks of countless hours of use, smooth hollows worn by generations of scribes who had sat in this same spot, performing this same sacred work. He arranged his materials with habitual precision. A fresh sheet of vellum, prepared the previous week and now ready to receive text. 3 quills, each cut to his preferred angle. A small ceramic pot of ink, a straightedge for ruling lines, and a piece of soft leather for erasing mistakes. The vellum itself represented weeks of careful preparation. Made from calfskin, it had been stretched, scraped, and treated with chalk dust until it achieved the smooth, pale surface that would hold ink without bleeding. Colman ran his fingers across its texture, feeling the subtle variations that told him how the quill would interact with each section. Some areas would accept ink readily, while others would require a lighter touch. This knowledge came from years of experience, a tactile understanding that lived in his hands rather than his conscious mind. He began the day's work by ruling the page, using a lead stylus to create faint guidelines that would keep his text straight and evenly spaced. The task required concentration, but had become so familiar that his hands knew the rhythm without thought. Press the straightedge firmly against the vellum, draw the stylus along its edge with steady pressure, move down precisely 1 thumb's width, repeat. The repetitive motion brought a meditative quality to the morning, his breathing settling into a calm pattern that matched the slow progress of the stylus across the page. When the guidelines were complete, Colman turned his attention to the exemplar, the manuscript he was copying. This particular text was a gospel book, its pages filled with dense Latin script that told the story of Matthew's account of Christ's life. The exemplar itself was perhaps 50 years old, copied by a scribe whose name had been recorded in a colophon at the text's end. Colman felt a sense of connection to this unknown predecessor, imagining the monk who had sat much as he now sat, transforming words from one page to another with the same patient attention. He selected a quill and tested its tip against a scrap of vellum kept for this purpose. The cut was fresh, the angle precise, and ink flowed smoothly from the tip when he dipped it into the pot. Satisfied, Colman positioned himself over the page, his left hand steadying the vellum while his right hand brought the quill to the first guideline. The opening words of the day's work would begin a new chapter, and he paused for a moment, saying a brief prayer that his hand would remain steady and his attention undistracted. The first stroke of ink against vellum always brought Colman a quiet satisfaction. The quill moved with practiced ease, forming the tall vertical line that would begin the letter. Each subsequent stroke built upon the last, creating the distinctive shapes of insular script, the style of writing that had developed in Irish and British monasteries over the previous centuries. The letters were angular and precise, with tall ascenders and deep descenders that gave the text a rhythmic visual pattern. Colman worked slowly, never rushing. Each letter received the same careful attention, from the most elaborate initial to the smallest punctuation mark. His concentration was complete yet relaxed, a state of focused awareness that excluded distraction without creating tension. The scratch of the quill provided a gentle rhythm, while the scent of oak gall ink, earthy and slightly metallic, filled the space around his desk. By mid-morning, the light through the window had strengthened, casting a warm glow across the scriptorium. Colman had completed several lines of text, his progress measured and steady. He paused occasionally to recut his quill or to compare his work with the exemplar, ensuring that each word matched the original perfectly. These brief pauses also gave his eyes a chance to rest, his gaze drifting to the window where he could see clouds moving slowly across the sky. The other scribes maintained their own rhythms of work. Brother Finian, the eldest at 47 years old, worked on an illuminated page, adding delicate spirals of gold leaf to an initial letter. The younger brother Aidan copied a psalter, his pen moving with increasing confidence as his skill developed. Brother Brendan, who specialized in preparing vellum, worked at a table near the far wall, treating sheets with pumice stone to achieve the perfect surface. The presence of these companions created a sense of shared purpose, without disrupting the essential solitude that manuscript work required. As the morning progressed toward midday, Colman found himself settling even more deeply into the rhythm of copying. His breathing had slowed, his posture had softened slightly, and the world beyond his page had receded into gentle background awareness. The text flowed from exemplar to new vellum through the medium of his trained hand, each letter a small act of preservation and transmission. He thought occasionally about the readers who would eventually encounter this gospel book, monks in other monasteries, or perhaps traveling scholars who would borrow it for study. The idea that his work would serve purposes he could not fully imagine brought him a deep contentment. The bells for sext rang across the monastery grounds, their tones clear and melodious in the spring air. Colman completed the word he was writing and set down his quill with gentle precision. The rhythm of monastic life divided the day into sections marked by prayer, and he welcomed these pauses as opportunities to rest his eyes and straighten his back. He rose from his stool, feeling the stiffness in his shoulders that always accumulated after several hours of steady work, and made his way toward the stairs. Outside, the world had fully awakened to spring. The grass in the monastery's garth had taken on the vivid green that only Irish springtime could produce, and the herb garden near the kitchen building showed the first shoots of new growth. Colman walked slowly toward the church, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his steps following the worn path that generations of monks had traveled. The prayers of sext were brief, their familiar Latin phrases flowing through the community like water over smooth stones. After prayers came the midday meal in the refectory, where the brothers ate in silence while one of their number read aloud from a devotional text. Colman ate slowly, savoring the simple food, bread, cheese, and a thin soup flavored with herbs from last summer's harvest. The bread was dense and slightly sour, the cheese mild and smooth, and together they provided the sustenance needed for the afternoon's work. He drank ale from a wooden cup, the cool liquid pleasant against his throat after the morning's concentration. The afternoon session in the scriptorium began as the meal ended. Colman climbed the spiral stairs once more, his body already anticipating the return to his desk and the continuation of his work. The afternoon light came through the window at a different angle now, softer and warmer, creating a golden quality in the air. He settled onto his stool, checked the level of ink in his pot, selected a fresh quill, and resumed his copying where he had left off. The work of the afternoon mirrored the work of the morning, the same careful attention, the same steady progress, the same meditative quality that made hours pass without notice. Colman had learned long ago that manuscript copying required a particular kind of patience, not the forced endurance of difficult tasks, but rather a natural settling into the work's own rhythm. Each letter emerged from the tip of his quill at its own pace, neither hurried nor delayed, each word building upon the last like stones in a carefully constructed wall. As the sun moved lower in the sky, the shadows in the scriptorium lengthened and shifted. The quality of light changed from golden warmth to the cooler tones of late afternoon, and Colman knew, without looking at the sundial in the garth below, that vespers would soon interrupt his work. He had completed perhaps half a page of text, a satisfying progress that represented hours of sustained attention. Each line was straight, each letter properly formed, each word an accurate reflection of the exemplar's content. When the bells for vespers finally rang, Colman finished the line he was writing and carefully cleaned his quill before setting it aside. He sprinkled fine sand across the fresh ink to help it dry more quickly, then covered his work with a clean cloth to protect it from dust overnight. These small rituals of ending the day's work had their own comfort, marking the transition from labor to prayer with gentle gestures that required no conscious thought. The evening prayers brought the community together once more in the church, their voices joining in psalms that had been sung in this place for generations. After prayers came the evening meal, another simple offering of bread and ale, eaten in the same peaceful silence as the midday meal. Colman felt the deep tiredness that came from hours of focused work, a pleasant heaviness in his limbs, and a quiet satisfaction in his mind. As darkness settled over the monastery, the brothers made their way to the dormitory. Colman's sleeping space occupied a small cell in the stone building adjacent to the church, furnished with a narrow bed, a wooden chest for his few possessions, and a small shelf that held his prayer book. He prepared for sleep with the same unhurried attention he brought to all his tasks, removing his outer robe and folding it carefully, saying his private prayers while kneeling beside the bed. The night air carried the scent of rain approaching from the west, and through the narrow window of his cell, Colman could see stars appearing between the clouds. He lay down on his bed, pulling a wool blanket over himself, feeling the day's work settling into his body as a pleasant tiredness. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, more text to copy, more letters to form, more pages to preserve, and this knowledge brought him not boredom but rather a deep sense of purpose and peace. The sound of waves breaking on the distant shore reached him faintly through the window, a rhythmic reminder of the ocean's constant presence. Colman's breathing slowed further, matching the gentle rhythm of the waves, his body releasing the last tension of the day. He thought briefly of the page he had completed, the words now safely resting under their protective cloth, waiting for tomorrow's continuation. His last waking awareness was of gratitude for the work that filled his days, for the community that surrounded him, for the simple gift of serving a purpose larger than himself. The morning arrived with the familiar sound of bells calling the community to prayer, their tones carrying through the pre-dawn darkness like threads of sound connecting earth to sky. Colman woke slowly, his body responding to rhythms that had become as natural as breathing after 11 years in the monastery. He rose from his bed, dressed in the dim light, and made his way through the cold air to the church where his brothers were already gathering. After lauds and the morning meal, he returned to the Scriptorium as the first gray light of dawn began to illuminate the eastern horizon. The climb up the spiral stairs brought him fully awake, each step a gentle transition from sleep to work. His desk waited exactly as he had left it the previous evening, the covered page resting beneath its protective cloth like a secret waiting to be revealed. Colman uncovered his work and examined yesterday's progress with fresh eyes. The text looked even better than he remembered, the letters properly formed and evenly spaced, the ink a rich dark brown against the pale vellum. He felt again that quiet satisfaction that came from work done well, from attention sustained without wavering. Today he would continue where he had stopped, adding new lines to the page until it was complete. The morning light strengthened gradually, filling the scriptorium with the cool illumination that Colman preferred for detailed work. He prepared his materials with the same careful sequence he followed every day, testing quills, checking ink consistency, positioning the exemplar for easy reference. These small rituals helped his mind settle into the focused state that manuscript copying required, creating a bridge between ordinary consciousness and the deeper concentration of skilled work. Brother Finian arrived shortly after Colman, his footsteps slow on the stairs, his breathing slightly labored from the climb. At 47 years old, with silver-threaded hair and hands that trembled slightly before they warmed to their work. Finian had spent more than 30 years in the Scriptorium. He greeted Colman with a slight nod and moved to his own desk, where an elaborate initial letter awaited the addition of red pigment to complement yesterday's gold leaf. The two monks worked in companionable silence for some time, the only sounds the scratch of quills and the occasional creak of wooden stools. Young Brother Aidan joined them as the light strengthened further, bringing with him the fresh energy of youth and the slight clumsiness that still marked his movements. He was 18 years old, with ink-stained fingers that matched Colman's and an eagerness to learn that reminded the older scribe of his own early years in this room. Colman's quill moved steadily across the vellum, forming the distinctive letters of insular script with practiced ease. The text he was copying described Christ's teachings in the Gospel of Matthew, passages about patience and trust that seemed particularly appropriate to the work of manuscript preservation. Each word required multiple strokes of the pen, each stroke a small gesture of faith that this labor mattered, that these words deserved to be carried forward through time. By mid-morning, he had added 3 more lines to yesterday's work. The page was taking shape beautifully, the text creating a visual rhythm that pleased his eye. He paused to sharpen his quill, using a small knife kept specifically for this purpose, carefully shaving away the worn tip to reveal fresh material beneath. The task required steady hands and clear vision, both of which he still possessed fully at 29 years old. The scent of fresh bread drifted up from the kitchen building below, mixing with the familiar smells of ink and vellum that permeated the scriptorium. Brother Aidan's stomach rumbled audibly, and Finian glanced up with the hint of a smile before returning to his illumination work. These small moments of shared humanity punctuated the hours of solitary concentration, reminders that they were not merely scribes, but brothers living a common life. Colman found his thoughts drifting occasionally to the history of the manuscript he was copying. The exemplar had been created in another monastery, perhaps in Northumbria, or one of the Scottish islands where Irish monks had established communities. It had traveled here through means he could only imagine, carried by a visiting scholar, perhaps, or sent as a gift between abbots. Now it rested on his desk, its pages worn smooth by the hands of readers, its text waiting to be renewed in fresh copies that would themselves travel to other places, other times. The bells for sext interrupted his reverie, and he set down his quill to join the community for prayer. The walk to the church gave him a chance to stretch his legs and rest his eyes, which had begun to feel the strain of close work. The spring air had grown warmer since morning, and clouds were building in the west, suggesting rain might arrive by evening. In the church, the brothers' voices rose together in psalms, the Latin words flowing in familiar patterns that required no conscious thought. After the midday meal, Colman returned to find the scriptorium bathed in strong afternoon light. He had learned over the years to adjust his work to the changing conditions of illumination. Morning light was best for fine details, while afternoon light served well for larger letters and less intricate passages. Today's text required careful attention, but no elaborate decoration, so the afternoon hours would serve his purpose perfectly. He worked steadily through the afternoon, adding line after line to the growing page. The physical act of writing had long ago become second nature, freeing his mind to engage with the content he was copying. The gospel passages spoke of lilies in the field and birds of the air, of providence and trust in divine care. These themes resonated with the simplicity of monastic life, where each day's needs were met through communal labor and where elaborate possessions held no place. Brother Brendan appeared in the doorway carrying a stack of freshly prepared vellum sheets, their surfaces pale and smooth from his careful treatment. He was 34 years old, with strong hands well suited to the physical labor of vellum preparation, and a quiet manner that made his presence unobtrusive. He distributed several sheets to each scribe, placing them carefully on designated areas of their desks, then departed as silently as he had arrived. Colman accepted the new vellum with gratitude, running his fingers across one sheet to assess its quality. Brendan's work was always excellent, the surface neither too smooth nor too rough, the thickness consistent throughout, the edges cut perfectly square. Good vellum made the scribe's work easier and produced superior results, and Colman made a mental note to thank Brendan properly when next they spoke. As the afternoon progressed, he completed the page he had been working on and began preparing a fresh sheet of vellum for tomorrow's continuation. The ruling of guidelines had become almost meditative over the years, the repetitive motion allowing his mind to rest, while his hands performed their familiar task. He used a bone folder to score very faint lines that would guide his text without showing prominently in the finished work. The light had begun to shift toward the golden tones of late afternoon when Finian set down his brush and spoke for the first time that day. His voice was quiet, respectful of the Scriptorium's peaceful atmosphere. He asked Colman's opinion about a color mixture he was considering for a decorative element, wondering whether more yellow should be added to achieve the proper shade of green. Colman rose from his stool and moved to examine Finian's work, grateful for the opportunity to stretch and to engage with his brother's artistry. The illumination was exquisite, a complex pattern of interlaced spirals that seemed to move despite their fixity on the page. The green in question would fill certain sections of this pattern, and after some discussion, both monks agreed that the current mixture was nearly perfect, requiring only the slightest adjustment. This brief exchange of professional consultation deepened the sense of shared purpose that existed among the scribes. Though each worked largely in isolation, they formed a community of craftsmen whose combined efforts produced the monastery's most precious exports. Gospel books copied here would travel to other monasteries, where they would be treasured and studied, their beauty and accuracy reflecting well on the Irish tradition of scholarship and devotion. Colman returned to his desk as the bells for Vespers began to ring across the monastery grounds. He completed the ruling he had been working on, cleaned his tools with methodical care, and covered his materials for the night. The day's work had been satisfying, a full page completed, a new page prepared, steady progress maintained without strain or hurry. These accumulated days of patient labor would eventually produce a complete gospel book, a tangible manifestation of time transformed into sacred text. The evening followed its familiar pattern of prayer, meal, and preparation for sleep. As Colman lay in his cell listening to the rain that had finally arrived, pattering softly against the stone walls and thatched roof. He felt the deep contentment that came from days spent in meaningful work. The monastery existed as an island of prayer and learning in a world that could be harsh and uncertain, and his contribution to this mission, though humble, felt significant and right. Sleep came easily, accompanied by the sound of rain and the distant murmur of the ocean. His last conscious thought was of tomorrow's work, of the fresh vellum waiting on his desk, of the words that would take shape beneath his patient hand. The rhythm of this life, prayer, work, rest, repeated day after day, had become not a burden but a gift, a structure that held meaning and purpose within its simple repetitions. The following morning arrived with clear skies, the rain having moved eastward during the night. Colman woke to the sound of birds singing in the monastery's garth, their voices jubilant in the fresh-washed air. He dressed and made his way to Lauds, then to breakfast, then up the familiar stairs to the Scriptorium where another day of copying awaited him. The vellum he had prepared yesterday was ready to receive text, its ruled lines faint but clear, its surface perfectly receptive to ink. Colman settled onto his stool, arranged his materials, said his brief prayer for steady hands and clear vision, and began. The quill touched vellum, ink flowed, letters took shape. The work continued, as it had continued yesterday, as it would continue tomorrow, each day adding its contribution to the slow, patient accumulation of pages that would eventually become a book. Hours passed in focused concentration. The light moved across the scriptorium floor, marking time's passage in shifting patterns of brightness and shadow. Young Aidan made a small error in his copying and carefully scraped it away with a knife, his face showing the concentration required for this delicate correction. Finian hummed softly while mixing pigments, a tuneless melody that seemed to help him maintain his rhythm. Brendan appeared briefly to collect vellum scraps for reprocessing, his movements efficient and unobtrusive. By midday, when the bells called them to sext, Colman had added 4 more lines to his new page. The text was proceeding well, each word matching the exemplar with careful accuracy. He felt pleased with the morning's progress, not because he had rushed or pushed himself, but because sustained attention had produced steady results. This was the secret of manuscript work, not brilliance or speed, but simple persistence applied day after day without faltering. The afternoon brought different light again, and with it continued copying. Colman's hands moved with their characteristic measured grace, forming letters that seemed to flow naturally from exemplar to new page through the medium of his trained skill. He no longer thought consciously about the shape of each letter. His hands knew what to do, guided by years of practice and by an internalized sense of proportion and beauty. As Vespers approached, he completed another satisfying section of text and prepared to end the day's work. The page was filling beautifully, the text dense but readable, the letters consistent in size and spacing. Tomorrow he would continue, adding more lines, moving steadily toward the page's completion. And when this page was finished, another would follow, and then another, until finally the entire gospel book existed in fresh copy, ready to begin its own journey through time and space. The evening prayers, the simple meal, the quiet walk to his cell, all these formed the gentle conclusion to another day of meaningful labor. Colman lay down to sleep with the same sense of peaceful completion that had blessed his previous night's rest. The work was good. The community was stable. The rhythms of prayer and labor created a life that felt both purposeful and sustainable. He asked for nothing more than the continuation of these days, this work, this quiet devotion to preservation and beauty. The days that followed established themselves in gentle succession, each one similar to the last, yet subtly different in the way that waves are both constant and ever-changing. Colman woke each morning to the bells, attended prayers, broke his fast, and climbed the spiral stairs to his waiting work. The gospel text grew steadily beneath his careful hand, accumulating words and lines and pages with the patient inevitability of seasons turning. Spring deepened across the Irish countryside. Through the scriptorium's narrow window, Colman could see the monastery's apple trees beginning to show the first pale blossoms, delicate against the gray stone walls. The grass in the garth had grown thick and lush, and Brother Colman, who tended the gardens, could be seen moving among the herb beds in the early morning hours, his bent form a familiar sight against the green landscape. On the seventh day after completing his first page, Colman began work on an elaborate initial letter that would mark the beginning of a new chapter in the Gospel. This task required different skills than ordinary copying, greater artistic vision, more varied use of the quill, careful planning of space and proportion. He had sketched the letter lightly in lead the previous afternoon, creating a framework that would guide this morning's ink work. The letter was a tall capital, its vertical stroke extending upward nearly 3 times the height of regular text. Within and around this stroke, Colman would add decorative elements drawn from the vocabulary of insular art, spirals, knots, and geometric patterns that transformed a simple letter into a meditation on beauty and complexity. He worked slowly, even more deliberately than usual, allowing each curved line to find its natural shape beneath his quill. Brother Finian paused in his own work to observe Colman's progress, his experienced eye assessing the younger monk's technique. After some time, he offered a quiet suggestion about the spacing of the spiral patterns, advice given gently and received gratefully. Colman adjusted his approach slightly, and the change improved the letter's balance immediately. This exchange of knowledge between experienced and less experienced scribes formed part of the Scriptorium's invisible curriculum. Wisdom passed from generation to generation through observation and occasional comment. The morning advanced toward midday while Colman labored over the initial letter. His concentration was absolute yet relaxed, a state of focused awareness that excluded distraction without creating tension. The quill moved in small, controlled strokes, building up the letter's elaborate decoration gradually, patiently, allowing no element to dominate or disturb the overall harmony. By the time the bells rang for sext, the letter was perhaps half complete, its basic structure established and several decorative elements fully realized. After prayers and the midday meal, Colman returned to find the afternoon light streaming through the window at its customary angle. He settled back onto his stool and resumed work on the initial letter, adding more spirals, refining the curves, ensuring that each element contributed to the whole. The decoration was not merely ornamental but served a practical purpose. It signaled to readers that a new section of text was beginning, providing visual punctuation that aided comprehension and study. Young Aidan approached during the afternoon, drawn by curiosity about Colman's decorative work. At 18 years old, with growing confidence in basic copying but limited experience with illumination, he watched with open interest as the older monk's quill traced intricate patterns on the vellum. Colman welcomed the attention, pausing occasionally to explain his choices or to demonstrate a particular stroke. Teaching reinforced his own understanding while building the skills of the next generation, a cycle of learning that had sustained the Scriptorium for decades. The letter was complete by the time vespers rang across the monastery grounds. Colman examined it with critical satisfaction, noting both its strengths and the small imperfections that marked it as handmade rather than mechanical. The overall effect was pleasing. The decoration enhanced rather than overwhelmed the letter's basic form, and the patterns flowed naturally from one element to another. Tomorrow he would continue with regular text, but today's accomplishment would mark this page as special, a moment where craft rose briefly toward art. That evening, after prayers and the simple meal, Colman found himself walking in the monastery's garth as twilight settled over the landscape. The air held a mild warmth that promised summer's eventual arrival, and the scent of apple blossoms drifted on a gentle breeze from the west. Other monks walked as well, some alone in meditation, others in pairs engaged in quiet conversation. This brief period between supper and compline offered a chance for reflection and gentle exercise after hours spent in focused work. Brother Brendan fell into step beside Colman, and the two walked in companionable silence for some time before beginning to speak. Their conversation moved unhurriedly from topic to topic: the quality of the latest batch of vellum, plans for expanding the herb garden, news from a traveling monk who had visited the previous week. These exchanges of everyday information helped maintain the bonds of community, reminding each monk that he was part of something larger than his individual labor. As full darkness arrived, the brothers made their way to compile the final prayers of the day. The church was dim, lit only by a few candles that cast long shadows across the stone walls. The chanted prayers had a particular beauty at this hour, the voices blending in the darkened space, creating an atmosphere of peace that prepared body and mind for sleep. Colman felt the day's work settling into memory as he sang, the elaborate initial letter joining the accumulated store of pages and words and quiet hours that defined his life in this place. Sleep came swiftly that night, untroubled by dreams or restlessness. His body had learned long ago to release the day's concentration completely, trusting that tomorrow would bring renewed energy and continued progress. The rhythm of monastic life, its regular divisions of prayer, work, and rest, created a framework that supported both physical health and spiritual growth, asking much but providing structure and meaning in return. The following days continued the established pattern. Colman returned to regular copying, adding line after line to the growing gospel text. The work required sustained attention, but had become so familiar that it induced a meditative state, his conscious mind free to engage with the content even as his hands performed their trained tasks. He found himself particularly moved by certain passages. Christ's words about taking no thought for tomorrow, the promise that sufficient unto the day was the evil thereof. These teachings resonated deeply with the monastic commitment to living in the present moment, accepting each day's gifts and challenges without excessive concern for future outcomes. The manuscript itself embodied this principle. One could not copy an entire gospel in a single day, but one could form a single letter perfectly, and then another, and another, until pages accumulated and eventually the work was complete. The secret was not to think too much about the distant goal, but to attend fully to the immediate task. By the end of the second week after beginning this particular gospel, Colman had completed 3 full pages and begun a 4th. The stack of finished work grew slowly but steadily, each page covered with his careful script, each word preserving the sacred text for future readers. He stored the completed pages in a wooden box designed specifically for this purpose, protecting them from dust and damage until they could be assembled into a bound volume. Brother Finian's illumination work progressed alongside Colman's copying, the two efforts complementing each other in their shared purpose. Finian had completed several elaborate initial letters and was now working on a full-page illustration that would face the beginning of a new gospel. The image depicted an angel, its wings stylized into geometric patterns, its face serene and otherworldly. The work required days of careful painting, each color applied in thin layers that built up gradually to achieve depth and richness. Young Aidan, meanwhile, had finished copying his assigned psalter and now awaited a new assignment. The abbot would decide which text the young scribe should tackle next, considering both the monastery's needs and Aidan's developing skills. In the meantime, Aidan practiced decorative lettering on scrap vellum, working to achieve the control and precision that would eventually allow him to create illuminations as fine as Finian's. The scriptorium itself seemed to pulse with quiet industry, each scribe contributing to the collective mission of preserving and multiplying sacred texts. The monastery's reputation for excellent manuscript work had grown over the years, and occasionally wealthy patrons commissioned specific books, providing funds that supported the community's broader work. But most copying was done for the monastery's own library, or for exchange with other religious houses, part of a network of learning that connected Irish monasteries with communities across Britain and the European continent. Rain returned one afternoon, drumming steadily on the scriptorium's roof and creating a cozy atmosphere within the stone chamber. The sound provided a soothing backdrop to the work, and Colman found his concentration deepening even further, his awareness narrowing to the small space of vellum beneath his quill. Hours passed without conscious notice, marked only by the gradual accumulation of text and the slow progression of gray light across the floor. When the rain finally ceased and the sun emerged briefly before evening, the monastery's stones glistened with moisture and the air smelled of wet earth and growing things. Colman stretched his shoulders, feeling the pleasant tiredness that came from sustained focus, and glanced at his day's progress. Another half-page complete, the text flowing smoothly, the letters maintaining their consistent beauty. He felt that quiet satisfaction that needed no words, the simple recognition that the work was good and the day had been well spent. That evening's meal featured fresh greens from the garden, the first substantial harvest of the spring season. The tender leaves had been dressed with vinegar and oil, providing a bright contrast to the usual fare of bread and cheese. Brother Colman, who had cultivated these greens through careful attention and patient waiting, accepted the community's gratitude with characteristic modesty. His work in the gardens paralleled the scribe's work in the Scriptorium. Both required patience, skill, and daily attention to small tasks that accumulated into significant results. After complying, as Colman prepared for sleep in his cell, he reflected briefly on the nature of monastic life and the particular gift of manuscript work. The labor was demanding but not harsh, requiring concentration, but offering the deep satisfaction of creating something beautiful and permanent. Each completed page represented hours of careful attention transformed into tangible form, and each gospel book would carry the sacred text forward through time, serving purposes he could only imagine. The monastery itself existed as a repository of learning and prayer in a world where both were precious and sometimes precarious. Political changes, weather disasters, and the constant threat of Viking raids meant that nothing was guaranteed to last. Yet the work continued, generation after generation of monks climbing these same stairs, sitting at these same desks, forming these same letters with patient hands. Colman felt himself part of this larger story, a small but meaningful link in a chain extending backward to the monastery's founding and forward to an unknowable future. Sleep came gently, as it always did after days spent in meaningful work. His breathing slowed and deepened, his body releasing its last tension, his mind drifting toward rest. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, more text to copy, more letters to form, more quiet hours in the Scriptorium. And this knowledge brought not boredom but peace, the deep contentment of a life aligned with purpose and sustained by community. The rain had returned, falling softly now, and its gentle rhythm carried him into dreams as formless and peaceful as the darkness that surrounded his cell. Morning arrived with mist hanging low over the monastery grounds, softening the edges of buildings and transforming the familiar landscape into something dreamlike and mysterious. Colman woke to the bells as always, but today their sound seemed muffled by the thick air, reaching him as if from a greater distance than usual. He dressed in the cool dampness and made his way through the fog to the church, where candlelight glowed warm against the gray morning. After lauds and the morning meal, he climbed the spiral stairs to find the Scriptorium filled with diffuse light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The mist pressed against the windows, creating an atmosphere of gentle isolation that Colman found particularly conducive to concentrated work. He settled onto his stool, arranged his materials with habitual precision, and began the day's copying where yesterday's work had concluded. The gospel text he was transcribing had reached passages about teaching and parables, Christ's use of simple stories to convey complex truths. Colman appreciated the elegance of this approach, how ordinary images of seeds and soil, fishing nets and pearls, could carry meanings that resonated across centuries. His quill moved steadily, transforming these ancient words from the worn pages of the exemplar onto fresh vellum that would itself grow old in time, perhaps becoming an exemplar for some future scribe not yet born. Brother Finian arrived somewhat later than usual, moving carefully on the stairs, his breathing labored from the climb. At 47 years old, with joints that complained on damp mornings like this one, he sometimes needed extra time to prepare his body for the day's work. But once seated at his desk, his hands regained their characteristic steadiness, and he resumed work on his angel illustration with undiminished skill. The damp weather that troubled his joints made the pigments flow more smoothly, a small compensation that he had learned to appreciate over his many years of illumination work. The morning progressed in the scriptorium's customary quietness, broken only by the sounds inherent to the craft, quills scratching, stools creaking, the occasional soft rustle of vellum being repositioned. Young Aidan had received his new assignment from the abbot and was beginning work on a copy of selected writings by St. Jerome. The text was more complex than the Psalter he had completed, requiring careful attention to preserve the church father's arguments intact. Aidan's face showed his concentration, his tongue occasionally visible between his lips as he worked through particularly challenging passages. By mid-morning, the mist had begun to lift, revealing the monastery grounds in stages like a curtain slowly opening. First, the nearest buildings emerged, then the garden walls, finally the distant hills that rolled away toward the coast. Colman glanced up occasionally from his work to observe this gradual revelation, finding in it a metaphor for the slow illumination that study and prayer brought to the mind. Understanding came not all at once but gradually, through patient attention and repeated engagement with sacred texts. The bells for sext called them to prayer as the sun finally broke through the remaining mist, flooding the monastery with sudden brightness. The church felt especially beautiful in this clear light, the stone walls glowing warm and the small windows casting precise rectangles of brilliance on the floor. The brothers' voices rose together in familiar psalms, their words joining with centuries of prayer that had been offered in this space, and in countless other churches and monasteries scattered across Christendom. After the midday meal, Colman returned to discover that the afternoon light, so long delayed by morning mist, now filled the scriptorium with unusual intensity. He adjusted his position slightly to avoid glare on the vellum and resumed his copying. The text had reached the parable of the sower, with its descriptions of seed falling on different types of ground. Colman had copied this passage before in other manuscripts, but familiarity did not diminish its power. Each time he wrote these words, he found himself considering which type of ground his own heart resembled, whether the seed of prayer and study was producing the fruit it should. Brother Brendan appeared in the doorway carrying fresh supplies, more vellum, a sealed jar of oak gall ink recently prepared, several newly cut quills. He distributed these materials quietly, his presence efficient and unobtrusive. Colman accepted the new quills gratefully, examining their tips with an experienced eye. Brendan's cutting was excellent, each quill trimmed at precisely the angle that would produce the cleanest strokes. Small competencies like this, repeated daily throughout the monastery, created the foundation for everything else. The beautiful manuscripts, the successful harvest, the well-maintained buildings, the peaceful atmosphere that allowed prayer and study to flourish. The afternoon settled into its characteristic rhythm of sustained work. Colman added line after line to his growing page, his progress measured and steady. He had developed over the years an internal sense of packing that allowed him to maintain consistent output without strain or rushing. The work demanded full attention but not anxious effort, requiring instead a kind of relaxed vigilance that could be sustained for hours without exhaustion. Brother Finian rose from his desk near mid-afternoon and crossed to the small table where pigments were prepared and stored. He needed to mix a particular shade of blue for the angel's robe in his illustration, a color that would suggest both the earthly sky and the heavenly realm the angel inhabited. The mixing of pigments was itself a skilled craft, requiring knowledge of how different substances interacted and how colors would appear when applied in thin layers over white vellum. Finian worked with quiet confidence, adding tiny amounts of various powders to his base, testing the mixture on scrap vellum, adjusting until he achieved the exact tone he sought. Colman watched this process during one of his brief pauses, appreciating Finian's expertise and the care he brought to every aspect of his work. The older scribe treated each element of manuscript production with equal seriousness, recognizing that excellence required attention to countless small details. This standard of craftsmanship had been passed to Finian by his own teachers and would in turn pass to Aidan and eventually to younger monks who would follow. The chain of skill and knowledge extended backward and forward through time, connecting the present moment to both past and future in a continuous tradition. As the afternoon light began its slow shift toward evening, Colman completed another full page of text. He examined his work with satisfaction, noting the consistency of his script and the accuracy of his copying. Each page brought him closer to completing this gospel book, though the end remained many weeks distant. He did not allow himself to think too much about that distant completion, preferring to focus on the immediate task, the current page, the next line, the letter forming now beneath his quill. The bells for Vespers interrupted his work at their appointed time, and he cleaned his tools and covered his materials with the same careful attention he brought to every transition. The walk to the church gave him an opportunity to stretch his legs and clear his vision, which had begun to blur slightly from hours of close work. The evening prayers carried special beauty at this hour, the lengthening shadows in the church creating an atmosphere of peaceful conclusion to the day's labor. After the evening meal, Colman found himself drawn again to the garth for a brief walk before complying. The air had grown cooler with the approach of night, and the first stars were becoming visible in the darkening sky. He walked slowly, his hands clasped loosely before him, his mind reviewing the day's work without judgment or anxiety. The gospel text he had copied lingered in his thoughts, the sower scattering seed, the various types of ground receiving it, the mysterious alchemy by which some seeds produced abundant harvest while others produced nothing. Brother Diarmuid was also walking in the garth, pausing occasionally to examine plants in the fading light. The gardener was 61 years old, with earth-stained hands and a slight limp from an old injury, his face weathered by decades of outdoor work. He and Colman exchanged greetings and walked together for a time, their conversation touching lightly on the day's activities, the morning mist, the sudden afternoon sun, the progress of various growing things in the garden. These simple exchanges of observation and information formed part of the monastery's social fabric, maintaining connections that balanced the long hours of solitary work. As full darkness settled over the monastery, the community gathered once more for compliance. The final prayers of the day had an especially peaceful quality, the brothers' voices soft in the candle-lit church, the words ancient and familiar. Colman felt the accumulated tiredness of sustained concentration, a pleasant heaviness that promised easy sleep. The day had been productive and peaceful, marked by steady progress and the deep satisfaction that came from work done carefully and well. In his cell, preparing for rest, Colman reflected briefly on the gift of this life, its simplicity, its rhythm, its balance of solitude and community. The work of manuscript copying suited his temperament perfectly, providing sufficient challenge to engage his skills while offering the meditative quality that brought his mind to stillness. Each day resembled the previous one yet remained distinct, like the pages he copied that were similar yet unique in their small variations and imperfections. Sleep arrived gently, accompanied by the sound of wind moving through the monastery grounds and the distant murmur of waves against the rocky coast. His last waking thought was of tomorrow's work, of the fresh page waiting on his desk, of the text that would continue to unfold beneath his patient hands. The gospel story was both familiar and inexhaustible, revealing new depths with each copying, each reading, each moment of attention brought to its ancient words. The days that followed established themselves in their characteristic pattern, each morning bringing renewed energy and continued copying. The gospel text progressed steadily, accumulating pages in the protective wooden box, moving gradually toward the completion that remained distant yet inevitable. Colman's hands moved with practiced sureness, his eyes tracking between exemplar and fresh vellum, his mind engaged with the text while his skilled fingers performed their trained tasks. Spring continued its slow advancement toward summer. The apple trees in the monastery grounds completed their blossoming and began to show the first tiny fruits that would mature over the coming months. The herb garden flourished under Brother Diamuid's attentive care, the plants sending up new growth that would be harvested for cooking and healing. The sheep in the monastery's pastures produced lambs that gamboled in the green fields, their antics occasionally visible from the scriptorium window. Brother Finian completed his angel illustration after days of patient work, the figure emerging in layers of carefully applied pigment until it seemed almost alive on the vellum. The achievement represented the culmination of skills developed over 30 years of illumination work. Each element, the proportions, the colors, the decorative patterns, contributing to a whole that transcended the sum of its parts. The other scribes paused in their work to admire the completed illustration, offering sincere praise that Finian accepted with characteristic modesty. Young Aidan continued his copying of Jerome's writings, his skill visibly improving as he engaged with the more complex text. Mistakes became less frequent, his letter formation more consistent, his confidence growing with each completed page. Colman observed this development with pleasure, remembering his own progression from uncertain beginner to competent scribe. The process required time and patience, qualities that monastic life both demanded and cultivated. On a morning when light rain fell gently against the scriptorium windows, Colman began work on another elaborate initial letter. This one would mark the beginning of a new major section in the gospel text, requiring the same careful planning and execution that his previous decorative letter had demanded. He sketched the basic structure lightly, then began adding the intricate patterns that would transform simple form into elaborate ornament. The work demanded complete attention, each small stroke contributing to patterns that would eventually create the illusion of complex weaving and knotwork. Colman lost himself in this meticulous labor, time passing unmarked except by the gradual progress of the decoration. The rain continued its gentle percussion on the roof, creating a soothing backdrop that deepened his concentration rather than disturbing it. By afternoon, when the rain had ceased and watery sunlight emerged between clouds, the initial letter was well advanced. The basic patterns were established, the major elements in place, the overall design clearly visible. Tomorrow he would add final refinements and complete the decoration, but already the letter demonstrated the distinctive beauty of Irish manuscript work. Precise yet organic, complex yet harmonious, serving both practical and aesthetic purposes. The evening brought clear skies and a spectacular sunset that painted the western horizon in shades of orange and pink. After Vespers, several monks lingered outside to watch the display, their faces turned toward the fading light, their voices hushed in appreciation of natural beauty. Colman stood among them, grateful for this reminder that the created world itself was a kind of text, speaking of divine creativity and care through the language of light and color and form. That night, as he lay in his cell waiting for sleep, Colman found himself thinking about the relationship between the work of his hands and the larger purposes it served. The manuscripts created in this scriptorium would carry sacred texts to other places, other times, other hands. Future monks would read these pages, study these words, draw strength and guidance from these preserved teachings. His labor, though small and quiet, participated in something vast and enduring, the transmission of wisdom across generations, the preservation of truth against the erosion of time and chance. Sleep came peacefully, as it always did, carrying him into rest that would restore his energy for tomorrow's continuation of the work that filled his days with meaning and purpose. The morning after the sunset arrived with exceptional clarity, the air washed clean by yesterday's rain, and the sky a deep, unblemished blue. Colman woke to the bells and noticed immediately the quality of light streaming through his cell's small window, crisp and pure, promising ideal conditions for detailed work. He dressed quickly, his body responding eagerly to the prospect of completing the elaborate initial letter he had begun the previous day. After lauds and the morning meal, he climbed the stairs to find the scriptorium already bathed in brilliant morning light. The conditions were perfect for finishing the decorative work, the illumination strong enough to reveal every detail, yet not so harsh as to create glare on the vellum surface. Colman settled onto his stool with a sense of quiet anticipation, arranging his materials with extra care, knowing that this morning's work would demand his finest attention. The initial letter awaited him exactly as he had left it, the basic patterns established, and several sections fully realized. Today, he would complete the remaining decorative elements and add the final refinements that would bring the whole design into perfect balance. He selected his best quill, tested its tip against scrap vellum, and began work on the areas that remained unfinished. His hand moved with controlled precision, each stroke deliberate yet fluid, building up the intricate patterns gradually and patiently. The decoration consisted of interlaced spirals that seemed to weave over and under themselves in impossible ways, creating the illusion of three-dimensional form on the flat vellum surface. This particular style had developed in Irish and British monasteries over the previous century, combining influences from Celtic metalwork, Germanic interlace patterns, and Mediterranean manuscript traditions into something distinctive and original. Brother Finian worked at his own desk nearby, beginning preliminary sketches for another full-page illustration. He glanced occasionally at Colman's progress, his experienced eye monitoring the younger monk's technique without intrusion. The scriptorium held its characteristic quietness, broken only by the sounds of quills and brushes, the occasional creak of a stool, the soft breathing of concentrated work. By mid-morning, Colman had completed most of the remaining decoration. The initial letter was taking its final form, the patterns flowing naturally from one element to another, the overall design achieving the harmony he had envisioned. He paused occasionally to assess his progress from a slight distance, checking that no area dominated at the expense of others, ensuring that the decoration enhanced rather than overwhelmed the letter's basic structure. Young Aidan approached during one of these assessment pauses, drawn by interest in the decorative work. At 18 years old, with ink-stained fingers that betrayed his calling and an eagerness to learn that marked his character, he studied the initial letter with open admiration. Colman welcomed the interruption, using it as an opportunity to rest his eyes and to share knowledge with the younger scribe. He explained some of the design principles that guided decorative work, how patterns should balance complexity with clarity, how decorative elements should serve the text rather than compete with it, how the eye should be drawn into the design through carefully planned entry points and pathways. Aidan listened with focused attention, occasionally asking questions that showed his growing understanding of the craft's subtleties. These moments of teaching reinforced Colman's own knowledge while passing skills forward to the next generation, maintaining the continuous tradition that sustained the scriptorium's excellence. The bells for sext interrupted their conversation, and both monks made their way down the spiral stairs to join the community for prayer. The church felt especially peaceful in the midday light, the stone walls warm and the small space filled with the brothers' voices rising together in familiar psalms. After prayers came the meal, simple as always but satisfying. Bread, cheese, a porridge made from barley and flavored with herbs, ale to drink. Colman returned to the scriptorium to find the afternoon light beginning its characteristic shift, less direct than morning illumination, but still perfectly adequate for detailed work. He resumed his position at the desk and took up his quill, ready to add the final touches to the initial letter. These last refinements would require perhaps an hour of concentrated effort, bringing the decoration to completion and allowing him to return to regular text copying tomorrow. His hand moved with particular care through these final strokes, each one critical to the overall effect. He added small details that would only be noticed upon close examination, tiny flourishes that terminated spiral patterns, subtle variations in line weight that created depth and interest, carefully placed dots that punctuated the design at strategic points. These refinements represented the difference between competent work and excellent work, the extra attention that elevated craft toward art. Brother Brendan appeared in the doorway as Colman was completing his work, arriving to check whether any scribes needed fresh supplies. He paused to observe the finished initial letter, his appreciation evident in his expression, though he said nothing. Brendan understood manuscript work from a different angle. He prepared the materials that scribes transformed into books, but this understanding gave him deep respect for the skill required to use those materials well. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, Colman finally set down his quill and examined the completed initial letter with critical satisfaction. The decoration was finished, every element in place, the overall design achieving the balance and harmony he had sought. The letter would mark this section of the gospel as significant, drawing readers' attention and providing visual punctuation that aided both comprehension and aesthetic appreciation. Tomorrow he would return to regular copying, but today's accomplishment would remain visible for as long as the manuscript survived, decades, perhaps centuries, speaking across time of the patience and skill brought to this work. The bells for Vespers rang across the monastery grounds as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Colman cleaned his tools with extra thoroughness, feeling the satisfaction that came from completing a challenging task successfully. The walk to the church carried him through air that had grown cooler with the approach of evening, the light taking on the golden quality that preceded sunset. The prayers had particular beauty at this hour, the familiar words seeming to resonate with the day's accomplishments and the peaceful conclusion of focused labor. After the evening meal, Colman joined several other monks for a walk in the garth. The conversation moved easily among various topics: the extraordinary clarity of the day's light, plans for summer harvest, news from a letter that had arrived from a sister monastery in Northumbria. Brother Diarmuid spoke about the herb garden's progress, noting which plants were thriving and which required additional attention. These exchanges of information and observation helped maintain the community's cohesion, reminding each monk that his individual work contributed to a larger collective life. As darkness settled over the monastery, the brothers gathered for compliance. The final prayers of the day carried Colman into a state of peaceful tiredness, his body ready for rest after the sustained concentration of completing the decorative work. In his cell, preparing for sleep, he reflected on the day's accomplishments with quiet gratitude. The initial letter was finished, representing hours of patient effort transformed into something beautiful and permanent. Tomorrow would bring a return to regular copying, but the variety of tasks, ordinary text one day, elaborate decoration another, kept the work engaging and prevented monotony. Sleep arrived easily, his breathing slowing and deepening, his mind releasing its hold on conscious thought. The night was clear and mild, and through his window he He could see stars scattered across the darkness like seeds scattered by the divine sower whose parable he had been copying. The image pleased him. This connection between the text he preserved and the created world that surrounded the monastery. Both spoke of abundance and patience, of growth proceeding according to its own schedule, of purposes unfolding across time toward completion. The following morning brought a return to regular copying. Colman resumed work on the gospel text where he had paused to create the initial letter, his quill moving through the familiar patterns of ordinary script. The decorative work had been satisfying, but there was deep pleasure too in this simpler labor, the steady accumulation of text that would eventually complete the manuscript. His hands knew these letter forms intimately, could produce them almost without conscious thought, leaving his mind free to engage with the content, even as his fingers performed their trained tasks. The days that followed established themselves in peaceful succession. Spring continued its progression towards summer, the lengthening days bringing more light for work, and the warming weather making the scriptorium increasingly comfortable. The monastery's rhythms remained constant, bells marking the hours, prayers gathering the community, meals providing simple sustenance, work filling the spaces between with purposeful activity. Brother Finian began work on his next full-page illustration, this one depicting the evangelist Matthew at his writing desk. The image would require weeks of careful painting, each element, the evangelist's figure, his desk and writing materials, the architectural frame surrounding the scene, the decorative border enclosing the whole, demanding separate attention and skilled execution. Finian approached this major undertaking with characteristic patience, beginning with light sketches that would guide the eventual painting. Young Aidan progressed steadily through his copying of Jerome's writings, his confidence growing with each completed page. Colman observed this development with pleasure, noting how the younger scribe's letter formation had become more assured, and his copying pace more consistent. The progression from hesitant beginner to competent craftsman required time and sustained effort, but Aidan was demonstrating the persistence necessary for success in this demanding work. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the scriptorium windows and the sound of birdsong drifted up from the garth below, Colman realized that he had completed half of the gospel manuscript. The wooden box that held finished pages was now substantially full, representing weeks of patient copying. He paused in his work to consider this milestone, feeling neither pride nor impatience, but rather a quiet acknowledgement of progress made through steady attention to daily tasks. The work would continue, more pages to copy, more text to preserve, more weeks of patient labor stretching ahead toward eventual completion. But this moment of recognition felt significant, a natural point to appreciate how far the manuscript had come while remaining mindful of the distance yet to travel. Colman offered a brief prayer of gratitude for the opportunity to perform this work, for the skills that made it possible, for the community that supported and valued it. He returned to his copying with renewed focus, his quill moving across fresh vellum in the patterns that had become second nature. The gospel text unfolded beneath his hands, ancient words taking new form, preparing to begin their own journey through time and space. Each letter he formed participated in this transmission, connecting the present moment to both past and future in a continuous chain of preservation and renewal. The afternoon brought clouds that softened the light without diminishing it significantly. Colman adjusted his position slightly to accommodate the changed conditions and continued his copying without interruption. Hours passed in focused work, measured only by the gradual accumulation of text and the slow movement of shadows across the scriptorium floor. When the bells for Vespers finally rang, calling him away from his desk, he had added another satisfying portion to the growing manuscript. That evening, after prayers and the simple meal, Colman found himself reflecting on the nature of time as experienced within monastic life. The days proceeded with such regular rhythm that they seemed almost to exist outside ordinary temporal progression. Each morning resembled the previous one. Each afternoon followed its established pattern. Each evening brought the same peaceful conclusion. Yet within this apparent sameness, real change occurred. Manuscripts grew toward completion. Skills developed through practice. Seasons turned according to their ancient schedule. Lives unfolded toward purposes both known and unknown. This paradox, changeless routine producing genuine change, seemed to Colman to reflect something essential about spiritual life. Growth came not through dramatic transformations, but through small, repeated actions sustained over long periods. Prayer deepened not through mystical experiences, but through daily recitation of psalms. Skill improved not through sudden insight, but through patient practice. Character developed not through crisis, but through countless small choices made in ordinary moments. The manuscript work embodied this principle perfectly. One could not copy a gospel in a day, but one could form a single letter perfectly, and then another, and another, until gradually, almost imperceptibly, pages accumulated and the work approached completion. The secret was not brilliance or extraordinary effort, but simply showing up each day, taking up the quill, attending to the immediate task with full presence and care. Sleep came gently that night, carrying Colman into rest that would restore his energy for tomorrow's continuation of work that filled his days with meaning and quiet satisfaction. The days that followed the halfway milestone continued in their established rhythm, each morning bringing Colman back to his desk and the waiting gospel text. The season had fully turned toward summer now, the monastery grounds transformed by warmth and growth. Through the scriptorium window, he could see Brother Colman working among vegetables that had sprouted thick and green, their leaves catching sunlight in ways that made them seem to glow from within. The morning light arrived earlier with each passing day, filling the scriptorium with brightness well before the community gathered for lauds. Colman had adjusted his routine slightly to take advantage of these longer mornings, sometimes arriving at his desk while the eastern sky still held traces of dawn's colors. These quiet hours before the other scribes appeared held particular sweetness, the scriptorium entirely his own, the work unfolding in complete solitude broken only by birdsong drifting through the open window. On one such morning, working alone in the early light, Colman found himself copying a passage about the kingdom of heaven being like treasure hidden in a field. The parable spoke of a person who discovered this treasure and then, in joy, sold everything to purchase the field and possess what lay hidden within it. The words moved across the page in his careful script, and he considered their meaning while his hands performed their familiar work. The monastery itself seemed to him like that field, an ordinary place that contained hidden treasure for those who had eyes to see it. The treasure was not gold or jewels, but something more valuable: the opportunity to live with purpose, to work with meaning, to exist within a rhythm that supported both body and spirit. He had given up the possibility of other lives, marriage, family, worldly success, to possess this treasure, and the trade had proven more than fair. Brother Finian arrived as the full morning established itself, his footsteps slow on the stairs, his breathing audible from the climb. At 47 years old, with silver hair and hands marked by decades of careful work, he moved with the deliberate pace that age and wisdom together created. He greeted Colman with a slight nod and settled at his desk, where the illustration of Matthew awaited continued work. The evangelist's face had begun to emerge from Finian's careful painting, serene and thoughtful, eyes downcast toward the manuscript he held. Young Aidan joined them shortly after, bringing with him the fresh energy of youth and the slight awkwardness that still marked his movements. At 18 years old, with growing skill but not yet full mastery, he approached his copying with visible concentration. His assigned text of Jerome's writings had reached a particularly dense section of theological argument, and he paused frequently to ensure he captured each word correctly. Colman watched these pauses with understanding, remembering his own struggles with complex text during his early years as a scribe. The morning advanced through its customary progression of work and prayer. The bells for terce called them to brief devotions, then they returned to their desks. Later, sext would interrupt again, then the midday meal, then the afternoon session of copying that would continue until vespers. This regular pattern of work and prayer created a framework that made time both structured and fluid, each day distinct yet similar to all others. By midday, when the community gathered for the meal, Colman had completed another full page of gospel text. The accomplishment brought quiet satisfaction, not pride in achievement but simple recognition that the work continued to progress steadily. The meal featured fresh bread still warm from the ovens, cheese aged to sharp perfection, and early peas from the garden, sweet and tender. Brother Diamuid accepted the community's appreciation for these first vegetables with his characteristic modesty, deflecting praise toward the soil and weather that had made growth possible. The afternoon session brought a different light, less direct than morning but still perfectly adequate for detailed work. Colman resumed his copying, adding line after line to the fresh page that would join the growing stack of completed work. The gospel text had teachings about forgiveness, passages describing how often one should forgive a brother who sinned, not 7 times but 70 times 7, an endless extension of mercy that reflected divine patience with human failing. These teachings resonated with the realities of communal life, where brothers lived in close proximity and small irritations could accumulate if not released through forgiveness. The monastery's peace depended not on the absence of friction, but on the willingness to let go of grievances, to begin each day fresh, to extend to others the same patience and mercy one hoped to receive. Colman had learned this lesson slowly over his 11 years in community, discovering that the hardest person to forgive was often himself. That self-judgment could be harsher than any criticism from others. Brother Brendan appeared in the scriptorium during the afternoon, not to deliver supplies but simply to observe the scribes at work. He was 34 years old, with strong hands suited to physical labor, and a quiet presence that made him easy to overlook. He stood near the doorway for some time, watching the three scribes bent over their work, their quills moving in individual rhythms that somehow harmonized into a larger pattern of shared purpose. When Brendan finally departed, Colman realized that the vellum preparer's visit had been a kind of pilgrimage, a chance to see the materials he prepared transformed through skilled labor into something beautiful and permanent. Each monk's work supported the others. Brendan prepared vellum. The scribes transformed it into manuscripts. Other brothers maintained buildings and gardens that allowed this work to continue, all contributing to the monastery's mission of prayer and preservation. The community functioned like a body, each member performing different tasks, but all serving the same ultimate purpose. The afternoon progressed toward evening, the light gradually softening and taking on the warm tones that preceded sunset. Colman worked steadily, his concentration unbroken, his progress measured and consistent. By the time the bells for Vespers rang across the monastery grounds, he had nearly completed another page, bringing him closer to the manuscript's eventual completion, while maintaining the patient pace that prevented exhaustion and preserved quality. The walk to Vespers carried him through air that smelled of growing things and distant sea salt. The monastery occupied a position near the western coast, close enough to hear waves during storms but far enough inland to enjoy some protection from the worst weather. This evening, the ocean made itself known only through scent, and through the cries of gulls circling overhead, white shapes against the darkening blue of the sky. After evening prayers and the simple meal, several monks gathered in the garth for conversation before complying. Brother Diarmuid spoke about plans for the autumn harvest, noting which crops were thriving and which might need replacement next spring. Brother Finian mentioned that he hoped to complete the Matthew illustration within the month, allowing him to begin work on the next evangelist portrait. Young Aidan asked questions about manuscript binding, wondering how finished pages were assembled into completed books. Colman answered these questions, explaining the process by which loose pages were gathered into quires, sewn together along their spines, and attached to wooden boards covered with leather. He described how clasps were added to keep the book closed when not in use, protecting the pages from dust and damage. He spoke of the pride that came from seeing loose pages transformed into a bound volume, ready to begin its life as a tool for study and prayer. These conversations about craft and process helped maintain the community's shared understanding of their work's significance. The manuscripts they created were not merely objects, but vessels for preserving and transmitting sacred texts. Each gospel book, each psalter, each collection of patristic writings represented countless hours of skilled labor offered in service of purposes that extended far beyond individual lives or even generations. As darkness settled fully over the monastery, the brothers made their way to Compline. The final prayers of the day had particular beauty in summer, when mild air made the church comfortable, and the long twilight created a gentle transition from day to night. Colman's voice joined with his brother's, the familiar Latin phrases flowing easily, the rhythm of prayer marking the day's conclusion and preparing mind and body for rest. In his cell, preparing for sleep, Colman felt the deep tiredness that came from hours of sustained concentration. His shoulders held some stiffness from bending over his work. His eyes felt the strain of close attention to small letters. His fingers bore the day's accumulation of ink stains. But these physical markers of labor brought satisfaction rather than complaint. They testified to work done, to time spent purposefully, to skills employed in service of something meaningful. Sleep came quickly, his breathing deepening and slowing, his body releasing tension accumulated through the day. The night was mild and clear, and through his window he could see stars scattered across the darkness in patterns that had guided travelers and marked seasons since time beyond memory. Tomorrow would bring another day of copying, another opportunity to add text to the growing manuscript, another chapter in the quiet story of his life in this place. The following morning arrived with high clouds that filtered sunlight into diffuse brightness, perfect for detailed work. Colman woke to the bells feeling rested and ready, his body and mind prepared for the continuation of work that filled his days with purpose. The routine of prayer, meal, and climb to the scriptorium had become so familiar that it required no conscious thought. His movements guided by habit refined through years of repetition. At his desk, he resumed copying where yesterday's work had concluded. The gospel text continued its teachings about forgiveness and mercy, moving into parables about servants and debts, about the kingdom of heaven being like a king who wished to settle accounts. The imagery spoke to him of the vast debt each person owed to divine mercy, a debt so large it could never be repaid through human effort, but only accepted as a gift, and then extended to others in turn. Brother Finian worked on his Matthew illustration with particular concentration, adding fine details to the evangelist's hands where they held the manuscript. These hands were critical to the image's success. They had to convey both strength and delicacy, showing a person capable of physical labor, but engaged in the refined work of writing. Finian painted with tiny strokes, building up layers of pigment gradually, allowing each layer to dry before adding the next. Young Aidan had reached a section of Jerome's writing that dealt with translation principles, discussing how meaning could be preserved across languages while honoring both the original text and the receiving language's character. The passage seemed particularly relevant to their work as scribes, who dealt daily with questions of accuracy and clarity, with the challenge of preserving exact words while making them accessible to readers. Aidan copied with visible engagement, his earlier hesitation replaced by growing confidence. The morning advanced through its familiar pattern: work, prayer, more work, the midday meal. The afternoon brought continued copying, steady progress, and the gradual accumulation of text that characterized manuscript production. Hours passed in focused attention, measured by the movement of light across the scriptorium floor and the slow filling of pages with careful script. By late afternoon, Colman had completed the page he had begun yesterday and started a fresh sheet of vellum. The work continued its patient unfolding, each day adding to what had come before, each page joining those already finished in the protective wooden box. The end remained distant but inevitable, approaching at the same measured pace that had carried the manuscript from its beginning to this midpoint, and would eventually bring it to completion. The bells for Vespers rang as the sun moved low in the western sky, painting clouds with shades of amber and rose. Colman set aside his work and descended the spiral stairs, joining the flow of brothers making their way to the church. The evening prayers carried particular beauty in this light, the stone walls glowing warm, the familiar words seeming to resonate with the day's peaceful accomplishments. After the evening meal, Colman walked alone in the garth, his mind quiet, his body pleasantly tired from the day's sustained work. The monastery grounds were beautiful in the long summer twilight, the buildings solid and permanent against the changing sky, the gardens lush with growth, the pathways worn smooth by generations of feet following the same routes to prayer and work and rest. He thought about the manuscript growing page by page on his desk, about the countless other manuscripts that had been and would be created in this scriptorium, about the continuous chain of preservation that connected past to future through the patient labor of scribes who dedicated their lives to this quiet work. The thought brought him peace, this sense of participating in something larger than himself, contributing his small part to purposes that extended beyond individual understanding. As full darkness arrived and the stars emerged, Colman made his way to Compline. The final prayers of the day carried him into a state of peaceful completion, ready for the rest that would restore his energy for tomorrow's continuation of work that filled each day with meaning and gentle purpose. The summer days continued their gentle progression, each one marked by the familiar rhythms of monastic life and the steady advancement of manuscript work. Colman woke each morning to bells that rang earlier with the lengthening daylight, attended prayers that gathered the community in their shared purpose, and climbed the spiral stairs to work that awaited with patient constancy. The gospel text moved through its teachings with the same measured pace that characterized the copying itself. Parables gave way to longer discourses, Christ's words to his disciples about the difficulties they would face and the consolations they could expect. Colman's quill traced these passages onto fresh vellum, each word preserved with careful attention, each sentence maintaining the exact meaning of the exemplar from which he worked. Brother Finian's illustration of Matthew progressed toward completion. The evangelist's figure now existed in full detail, his robes painted in shades of blue and gold, his face serene with concentration, his hands positioned carefully around the manuscript he held. The architectural frame surrounding the figure had begun to take shape as well, columns and arches rendered in careful perspective, decorative patterns filling the spaces between structural elements. The work represented weeks of patient effort, layer upon layer of pigment applied with meticulous care. On a morning when light clouds drifted slowly across the blue sky, casting moving shadows on the monastery grounds, young Aidan completed his copying of Jerome's selected writings. The final page bore his signature in a small colophon, identifying him as the scribe and nodding the year of completion, 742. The young monk's face showed quiet pride as he presented the finished work to Brother Finian for inspection, waiting while the older scribe examined each page with experienced eyes. Finian's assessment was thorough and kind. He noted the sections where Aidan's work showed particular skill, pointing out passages where letter formation was especially consistent and where difficult abbreviations had been handled correctly. He also identified areas where improvement remained possible, showing Aidan how certain letters could be formed with slightly different techniques to achieve better results. The critique was constructive rather than harsh, offered with the understanding that skill developed gradually through practice and attention to detail. Colman watched this exchange with appreciation for how knowledge passed between generations. Finian had received similar instruction from his own teachers decades earlier, and Aidan would someday offer the same guidance to younger scribes who followed after him. This continuous transmission of skill and standards maintained the Scriptorium's excellence across time, ensuring that manuscripts produced here upheld the high reputation Irish monasteries had earned throughout Christendom. The completion of Aidan's manuscript meant he would receive a new assignment, but for now, he was granted a day of rest from copying to allow his eyes and hands to recover from the sustained effort. He spent the morning organizing his desk, cleaning his tools with unusual thoroughness, and preparing fresh quills for whatever work would come next. These small tasks of maintenance and preparation held their own value, creating space for transition between major projects while reinforcing the care that all aspects of manuscript work required. By midday, when the bells called the community to sext, Colman had added several more lines to his current page. The work continued its steady progression, neither hurried nor delayed, each letter emerging at its natural pace from the tip of his quill. He had learned long ago not to measure success by dramatic accomplishments, but rather by consistent application of skill over extended periods. The manuscript would be finished when it was finished, and rushing would only compromise quality without significantly advancing completion. After the midday meal and the brief rest that followed, Colman returned to find the afternoon light streaming through the Scriptorium windows at a steep angle. Summer had reached its fullest expression, the days long and warm, the monastery grounds bursting with growth and activity. Through the window he could see Brother Diarmuid working among the vegetables, his bent form moving slowly between rows, his hands engaged in the endless tasks of weeding and tending that summer gardens required. The afternoon session of copying brought Colman to a significant passage in the Gospel text, Christ's final discourse to his disciples before his arrest and crucifixion. The words carried particular weight, speaking of love and sacrifice, of commandments fulfilled through care for others, of the pattern of service that defined his ministry. Colman copied these passages with heightened attention, aware that he was preserving some of Christianity's most essential teachings. The work demanded not only technical skill, but also reverence for the content being transmitted. Each word mattered. Each phrase carried meaning that had shaped lives and communities across centuries. To copy these texts accurately was to participate in their preservation, ensuring that future readers would encounter the same words that had first been recorded by witnesses to the events described. The responsibility felt weighty but not burdensome, more like a trust offered than a burden imposed. Brother Brendan appeared in the Scriptorium during the afternoon, arriving with a visitor, a traveling monk from a monastery in Wales who had come seeking hospitality and bringing news from other religious communities. The visitor was 43 years old, with a weathered face that spoke of many journeys and a warm manner that quickly put others at ease. He had brought with him a small manuscript as a gift for the monastery's library, a collection of hymns copied in the distinctive Welsh style. The scribes paused in their work to examine this gift, noting the differences between Welsh and Irish manuscript traditions, while appreciating the skill evident in the book's production. The visitor spoke briefly about his own monastery's work, describing their scriptorium and the texts they were currently copying. This exchange of information helped maintain connections between distant communities, reminding each monastery that they participated in a larger network of learning and devotion. After the visitor departed to rest before evening prayers, the scribes returned to their work with renewed appreciation for their craft. The manuscript traditions being developed in various monasteries across Britain and Ireland represented a flowering of Christian learning and artistry, each community contributing its own innovations while maintaining connection to shared purposes. The books they created traveled between monasteries, carrying texts and artistic styles, cross-pollinating ideas and techniques in ways that enriched the entire tradition. Colman worked through the remaining afternoon hours with steady concentration, adding more gospel text to his growing manuscript. The passage he was copying had reached Christ's prayer for his disciples, asking that they be kept safe, that they remain united in purpose, that they be sanctified in truth. The words seemed particularly appropriate for monastic life, which sought exactly these things: safety within community, unity of purpose in shared work, sanctification through daily practice of prayer and service. When the bells for Vespers finally rang, calling him away from his desk, Colman had nearly completed another full page. He cleaned his quill with careful attention, covered his work to protect it from dust, and descended the spiral stairs to join his brothers for evening prayer. The church felt especially peaceful in the late afternoon light, the stone walls warm from the day's accumulated heat, the small windows casting precise rectangles of golden illumination on the floor. After Vespers and the evening meal, Colman found himself drawn to the monastery's small library, a room adjacent to the scriptorium where completed manuscripts were stored on wooden shelves. The collection had grown considerably over the monastery's 70-year history, now including dozens of volumes, gospel books, psalters, patristic writings, collections of hymns and prayers, chronicles recording the monastery's history and the deeds of its abbots. He moved slowly along the shelves, occasionally removing a volume to examine its pages, noting the different hands that had copied various texts. Some manuscripts dated from the monastery's earliest years, their pages showing the wear of frequent use, their script reflecting styles that had since evolved. Others were more recent, their vellum still pale and their text crisp. Together, they represented an accumulation of knowledge and devotion, thousands of hours of patient labor transformed into books that served the community's ongoing life of prayer and study. One volume in particular caught his attention, a gospel book copied perhaps 20 years earlier by a scribe whose name appeared in the colophon as Brendan. Colman wondered if this might be the same Brendan who now prepared vellum, whether the man who performed the physical labor of vellum preparation had once sat at a scribe's desk forming letters as Colman now did. The thought created a sense of connection across time and changing roles, reminding him that lives unfolded in unexpected ways while remaining dedicated to the same essential purposes. As twilight deepened toward full darkness, Colman returned the manuscript to its shelf and made his way toward Compline. The final prayers of the day carried him into the peaceful tiredness that came from hours of meaningful work. In his cell afterward, preparing for sleep, he reflected on the day's quiet satisfactions: more text copied, a young scribe's manuscript completed, a visitor's gift enriching the library, his own continued progress toward eventual completion of the gospel book. Sleep arrived gently, accompanied by the sound of wind moving through the monastery grounds and the distant rhythm of waves against the rocky shore. His breathing slowed and deepened, his body releasing the day's accumulated tensions, his mind drifting toward rest. Tomorrow would bring another day of copying, another opportunity to add text to the growing manuscript, another chapter in the patient story of preservation and transmission that defined his life in this place. The following morning brought mist again, thick and damp, wrapping the monastery in soft grayness that muffled sound and obscured distance. Colman woke to bells that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, their tones diffused by moisture-laden air. He dressed in the cool dampness and made his way through fog to the church, where candlelight glowed warm against the pervasive gray. After lauds and the morning meal, he climbed the familiar stairs to find the scriptorium filled with the same diffuse light he had experienced during an earlier misty morning. The conditions were less than ideal for detailed work, but still adequate for copying, and he settled at his desk with the intention of continuing his steady progress despite the atmospheric challenges. His hands moved through their familiar preparations, arranging materials, testing quills, positioning the exemplar, and then his copying resumed where it had concluded the previous day. The gospel text continued its account of Christ's final hours with his disciples, moving from prayer into the narrative of betrayal and arrest. Colman copied these passages with somber attention, aware that he was preserving the story of events that had transformed human history. The words described darkness and confusion, fear and abandonment, yet they were told with a clarity that suggested the passage of time had brought understanding to what must have seemed chaotic when first experienced. Brother Finian worked nearby on final details of his Matthew illustration, adding tiny highlights that would bring the image to full completion. At 47 years old, with decades of experience guiding his hands, he approached this finishing work with the same patience he had brought to earlier stages. Each small touch of gold leaf, each careful line of pigment, contributed to the illustration's overall effect. The work could not be rushed, would not benefit from haste, and required only sustained attention until every element achieved its proper place. The mist persisted through morning and into afternoon, creating an atmosphere of gentle isolation that deepened the scriptorium's characteristic quietness. The world beyond the windows had disappeared into grayness, leaving only this room, these desks, this work that continued regardless of weather or season. Colman found the conditions surprisingly conducive to concentration, the mist seeming to muffle not just sound, but also distraction, allowing his attention to narrow completely to the text unfolding beneath his quill. By late afternoon, when the mist finally began to lift, he had completed another satisfying portion of text. The manuscript continued its patient growth, page by page, word by word, moving steadily toward the completion that remained weeks distant but certain. The work would be finished when it was finished, neither sooner nor later, and this acceptance of natural timing brought peace rather than impatience. As evening approached and the bells rang for vespers, Colman set aside his work with the same careful attention he brought to every transition. The day had been productive despite challenging conditions, proving once again that steady application of skill mattered more than perfect circumstances. He descended the stairs and made his way through air that was clearing gradually, revealing the monastery grounds in stages as the mist withdrew toward the ocean from which it had come. The evening prayers, the simple meal, the quiet hour before complying, all these followed their familiar pattern, marking another day's gentle conclusion. In his cell, waiting for sleep, Colman felt grateful for the work that filled his days, for the community that surrounded his efforts, for the simple gift of participating in something larger and more enduring than individual life. The weeks that followed the mist-filled day continued summer's slow arc toward its peak and eventual decline. The monastery grounds reached their fullest expression of growth, the gardens heavy with vegetables approaching harvest, the apple trees bearing fruit that would ripen in the coming months, the pastures thick with grass that would be cut and dried for winter hay. Through the scriptorium window, Colman observed these changes with the peripheral awareness that came from regular glances during brief pauses in his work. The Gospel manuscript progressed through its account of Christ's trial and crucifixion, passages that Colman copied with particular reverence. The text described suffering and injustice, yet it maintained a tone of dignity that transformed tragedy into something redemptive. His quill moved carefully through these sections, ensuring that each word matched the exemplar exactly, that no detail was lost or altered in the transmission from old vellum to new. Brother Finian completed his illustration of Matthew the Evangelist on a morning when light filled the scriptorium with unusual clarity. The finished image represented the culmination of weeks of patient work, each element contributing to a whole that captured both the evangelist's humanity and his sacred purpose. The other scribes paused in their own work to examine the completed illustration, offering sincere appreciation for Finian's skill and dedication. The older monk accepted their praise with quiet gratitude, already turning his thoughts toward the next evangelist portrait he would create. Young Aidan had received his new assignment, a collection of saints' lives that would require several months to complete. The text was lengthy and occasionally challenging, but Aidan approached it with the confidence that came from successfully completing his previous manuscript. At 18 years old, with ink-stained fingers and growing skill, he was becoming a true scribe rather than merely an apprentice. Colman watched this transformation with pleasure, remembering his own passage through similar stages of development. On a morning when birdsong filled the air outside and warmth promised the day would be long and pleasant, the traveling monk from Wales returned to the scriptorium before continuing his journey. He brought with him a request from his own monastery. Could the Irish brothers copy a particular text for their library, a commentary on the Pauline epistles that was not available in Wales. The visitor had brought vellum as payment for this service, fine sheets prepared by Welsh craftsmen according to slightly different techniques than those used in Ireland. The abbot was consulted and agreed to the commission, assigning the work to Colman once his current gospel manuscript was complete. This arrangement pleased everyone. The Welsh monastery would receive a needed text. The Irish monastery would gain valuable vellum for future projects, and connections between distant communities would be strengthened through this exchange of labor and materials. Such arrangements had become common as the network of monasteries across Britain and Ireland grew more extensive and interconnected. The visitor departed after the midday meal, blessed by the community and carrying provisions for his journey. His brief presence had reminded the scribes that their work served purposes beyond their immediate monastery, that manuscripts created here traveled to distant places where they would be studied and treasured by people they would never meet. This larger perspective reinforced the significance of maintaining high standards of accuracy and craftsmanship. The afternoon brought continued copying as sunlight streamed through the windows at its characteristic summer angle. Colman worked steadily through passages describing the events following the crucifixion, the burial, the empty tomb, the appearances of the risen Christ to his disciples. These accounts formed the foundation of Christian faith, the testimony on which everything else rested. To copy them accurately was to participate in their preservation, ensuring that future generations would encounter the same witness that had been passed down through centuries. Brother Brendan appeared during the afternoon with a question about vellum preparation. He had been experimenting with slight variations in his treatment process, seeking to achieve an even smoother surface that would accept ink more consistently. Could the scribes detect any difference in the recent sheets he had provided? Colman and Finian examined samples carefully, noting subtle improvements in texture and uniformity. Their feedback would help Brendan refine his techniques further. Another example of how different skills supported and enhanced each other within the monastery's communal life. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, Colman found himself reflecting on the interconnected nature of manuscript production. Each finished book represented the combined efforts of many people: those who raised sheep and prepared vellum, those who gathered materials and mixed ink, those who cut and prepared quills, those who ruled guidelines and copied text, those who created illuminations and decorative elements, those who bound loose pages into finished volumes. No single person could produce a manuscript alone. The work required community, cooperation, the harmonious coordination of diverse skills toward shared purpose. This recognition deepened his appreciation for monastic life itself, which functioned according to similar principles. The community's prayer life depended on everyone participating, adding their voices to the whole. The practical work of maintaining buildings and gardens and daily operations required contributions from all members, each performing tasks suited to their abilities and circumstances. The intellectual and spiritual work of study and contemplation, built upon foundations laid by previous generations, while preparing resources for those yet to come. When the bells for Vespers rang across the monastery grounds, Colman completed the line he was writing and prepared his materials for the night. Another day's work had been accomplished, another portion of gospel text preserved in fresh copy, another small contribution made to purposes that extended beyond individual comprehension. He descended the stairs and joined the flow of brothers making their way to evening prayer, his body pleasantly tired, his mind at peace. The evening prayers carried particular beauty as summer light streamed through the church's small windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted slowly in the still air. The brothers' voices rose together in psalms that had been sung in this place for decades, that would continue to be sung long after the current generation had passed into memory. This continuity across time felt especially present during the long summer evenings, when light lingered and the day seemed reluctant to release its hold. After the simple meal and before complying, Colman walked in the garden with Brother Diamuid, who spoke about preparations for autumn harvest. The gardens had produced abundantly this year, promising good stores for winter. The apple crop appeared healthy. The grain in the monastery's fields was ripening properly, and the sheep had thrived in the good weather. These practical matters formed the foundation for everything else. Without adequate food and resources, the work of prayer and study and manuscript production could not continue. Their conversation reminded Colman that monastic life balanced spiritual and material concerns, recognizing that embodied existence required attention to physical needs even while pursuing transcendent purposes. The gospel text he was copying affirmed this balance, describing a Christ who fed hungry crowds, who accepted invitations to meals, who spoke of God's provision for basic needs while teaching about treasures that neither moth nor rust could corrupt. As darkness settled over the monastery, the brothers gathered for compliance. The final prayers of the day had a particular gentleness during summer, when mild air made the church comfortable, and the transition to sleep felt natural rather than abrupt. Colman's voice joined with his brothers, the familiar words flowing easily, the rhythm of prayer marking the day's conclusion while anticipating tomorrow's continuation. In his cell, preparing for rest, Colman felt the deep satisfaction that came from days spent in meaningful work within a supportive community. His body was tired but not exhausted, his mind peaceful, his spirit content with the simple rhythms that structured his life. Through the window he could see stars beginning to emerge as full darkness arrived, their ancient light reminding him of the vastness of time and space within which his small life unfolded. Sleep came gently, his breathing deepening and slowing, his consciousness releasing its hold on waking concerns. The night was warm and still, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the ocean's endless rhythm against the shore. Tomorrow would bring another day of copying, another opportunity to add text to the growing manuscript, another chapter in the quiet story of preservation and transmission that gave his days their purpose and meaning. The following morning arrived with clear skies and the promise of exceptional light for detailed work. Colman woke feeling rested and ready, his body responding to rhythms that had become as natural as breathing after years of repetition. The familiar sequence of prayer, meal, and climb to the Scriptorium carried him smoothly into the day's work, each action flowing naturally into the next without requiring conscious decision. At his desk, he resumed copying where yesterday's work had concluded. The gospel text had reached its final passages, the appearances of the risen Christ, and his commissioning of the disciples to carry his teachings throughout the world. These concluding sections held particular significance, describing the transition from Christ's physical presence to the ongoing work of his followers in spreading the message of redemption and transformation. Colman copied these passages with heightened attention, aware that he was approaching the manuscript's completion. The end remained perhaps 2 weeks distant, but its approach had become tangible, no longer an abstract future but a concrete reality moving steadily closer. The recognition brought mixed feelings, satisfaction at the accomplishment approaching, but also a touch of sadness that this particular project would soon conclude. Brother Finian had begun preliminary sketches for his next evangelist illustration, this one depicting Mark. The planning stage required different skills than actual painting: the ability to envision the finished image, to compose elements in a harmonious relationship, to solve practical problems of space and proportion before committing to final execution. Finian worked with light strokes on scrap vellum, trying various approaches until he found one that satisfied his artistic vision. Young Aidan progressed steadily through his Saints' Lives manuscript, copying accounts of holy men and women whose faith and dedication had inspired generations. The stories described miracles and martyrdoms, visions and conversions, lives lived with intensity and purpose. Aidan worked with visible engagement, occasionally pausing to reflect on particularly moving passages before continuing his careful transcription. The morning advanced through its familiar pattern of work interrupted by brief prayers, each bell marking time's passage, while the copying continued its patient accumulation. By midday, Colman had completed another satisfying portion of text, bringing him closer to the goal that now felt genuinely achievable rather than merely theoretical. The manuscript that had begun months ago, as blank vellum and possibility, had become a substantial reality. Page after page of careful script preserving sacred text for future readers. After the midday meal and the brief rest that followed, the afternoon session brought continued copying in light that streamed through the Scriptorium windows with summer's characteristic golden quality. Hours passed in focused attention, the world beyond the monastery walls fading into background awareness, while the immediate task claimed full presence. This ability to lose himself in concentrated work was perhaps the greatest gift manuscript copying had given Colman: the capacity to inhabit each moment fully, without distraction or division of attention. By late afternoon, when the bells rang for vespers, he had nearly completed another page. Tomorrow he would finish it and begin what might be the manuscript's final page, though the exact endpoint remained uncertain until the text itself concluded. The work would be done when it was done, and anticipating that moment brought both eagerness and a desire to savor these last days of labor on this particular gospel book. The evening followed its established pattern of prayer, meal, and quiet hours before complying. Colman walked in the garth as twilight painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, the day's warmth lingering in the air. The monastery's stones radiating heat accumulated during the long summer afternoon. Other brothers walked as well, some alone in meditation, others in pairs engaged in quiet conversation. This peaceful hour between supper and the final prayers offered space for reflection and gentle transition toward rest. As full darkness arrived and the community gathered for Compline, Colman felt the day's work settling into memory, alongside all the previous days that had brought the manuscript to its current state. Each day had contributed its portion. Each session of copying had added pages. Each hour of attention had moved the work forward. The accumulation felt miraculous in its way. How small, repeated actions sustained over time could produce results that would have seemed impossible at the beginning. In his cell, waiting for sleep, he offered a brief prayer of gratitude for the work itself, for the skills that made it possible, for the community that supported and valued it, for the tradition that gave it meaning and context. Tomorrow would bring the continuation of the copying that would soon conclude, and he received this knowledge with peaceful acceptance, trusting that completion would arrive in its proper time. Sleep came easily, carrying him into rest that would restore energy for the final days of work on this manuscript that had occupied so many hours of his attention and care. The morning light arrived with exceptional clarity, streaming through Colman's cell window and painting the stone walls with warmth that promised another beautiful summer day. He rose with a sense of quiet anticipation, aware that today he would complete the page begun yesterday and begin what might indeed be the final page of the gospel manuscript. The bells called him to laud through air that smelled of gardens and distant sea, and he joined his brothers in prayer that welcomed the new day with gratitude and petition. After the morning meal, Colman climbed the spiral stairs with the familiar mixture of eagerness and calm that had characterized his approach to work throughout this manuscript's creation. The scriptorium awaited him exactly as he had left it the previous evening, his desk arranged with the materials he would need, the covered page resting beneath its protective cloth like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. He uncovered his work and examined yesterday's progress with fresh eyes. The text looked good, the letters properly formed and evenly spaced, the ink a rich dark brown that would remain legible for decades, perhaps centuries. Today he would complete this page and begin the next, moving steadily toward the manuscript's conclusion with the same patient attention that had sustained him from the beginning. The morning light strengthened as he settled onto his stool and took up his quill. His hand moved through the familiar motions of dipping into ink, positioning the quill at the proper angle, forming the first letter of the line. The gospel text continued its account of the risen Christ's appearances, describing how he revealed himself to the disciples through familiar gestures, breaking bread, showing his wounds, speaking their names. These details of recognition and revelation carried particular poignancy, suggesting how the divine made itself known through ordinary actions and intimate knowledge. Brother Finian arrived as the morning established itself fully, his footsteps slower than usual on the stairs. At 47 years old, with silver-threaded hair that caught the light and hands that showed the accumulated wear of decades of detailed work, he moved with the careful deliberation that age and wisdom together created. He settled at his desk where the sketches for Mark's portrait awaited further development. Today, he would refine these preliminary drawings, preparing them for the eventual transfer to the manuscript page, where they would be executed in final form. Young Aidan joined them shortly after, bringing with him the fresh energy that 18 years bestowed and the growing confidence that successful practice had built. His saints' lives manuscript progressed steadily, each day adding stories of devotion and transformation, each page preserving accounts that had inspired Christian communities for generations. He worked with visible concentration, his tongue occasionally appearing between his lips as he navigated particularly complex passages. The Scriptorium settled into its characteristic rhythm of quiet industry. 3 monks bent over their work, 3 quills moving across vellum in patterns both individual and harmonious. The sounds of their labor, quills scratching, stools creaking, the occasional rustle of vellum being repositioned, created a kind of music, not melodic but rhythmic, marking time's passage through repeated actions that accumulated into substantial achievement. By mid-morning, Colman had completed the page he had begun the previous day. He set it aside to dry completely and prepared a fresh sheet of vellum for what he believed would be the manuscript's final page. The realization that completion approached brought a heightened sense of attention, not anxiety, but rather a desire to maintain the same quality that had characterized all previous pages. The final page deserved the same care as the first, the same precision, the same reverence for the text being preserved. He ruled the fresh vellum with his lead stylus, creating the faint guidelines that would keep his text straight and properly spaced. The task had become so familiar over months of work that his hands performed it almost automatically, freeing his mind to contemplate what it meant to bring this particular manuscript to completion. The gospel book had occupied a significant portion of his year, had filled countless hours with purposeful labor, had become a kind of companion through changing seasons and weather, through the small variations and consistencies of daily monastic life. The bells for sext called them to brief prayers, and Colman rose from his stool with gratitude for the interruption. His eyes needed rest from close work. His shoulders needed to straighten from their bent position. His spirit needed the refreshment that communal prayer provided. The church felt especially peaceful at midday, the light strong through the windows, the stone walls radiating gentle warmth, the brothers' voices blending in psalms that had been sung here for generations. After the midday meal, Colman returned to find the afternoon light streaming through the Scriptorium at its characteristic angle. He had completed the ruling of the fresh page during the morning, and now he would begin adding text, the final words of Matthew's Gospel, the Great Commission in which Christ sent his disciples into all the world to make disciples of all nations, baptizing them and teaching them everything he had commanded. These words carried immense historical weight, describing the beginning of Christianity's expansion from a small group of Jewish followers to a movement that would eventually span continents and cultures. His quill touched the vellum, and the first letter of this final page took shape beneath his trained hand. The familiar motion brought its characteristic satisfaction, the pleasure of skill applied to meaningful purpose, the simple joy of transforming blank surface into text that would endure. He worked with steady concentration, each letter receiving the same attention as thousands that had come before, each word preserved with identical care. Brother Brendan appeared in the Scriptorium during the afternoon, carrying not supplies but simply his presence, his quiet wish to observe the work being done with materials he had prepared. He stood near the doorway as he had on a previous visit, watching the scribes at their labor, his expression showing the deep respect one craftsman held for the skills of others. After some time, he approached Colman's desk and examined the growing page with careful attention. "The vellum takes the ink well," Brendan observed quietly, his voice barely above a whisper to avoid disturbing the Scriptorium's peace. The surface preparation was good. Colman nodded his agreement, grateful for the quality of materials that made his work easier and more successful. "It has been excellent throughout," he replied softly. "The entire manuscript has benefited from your careful preparation." This brief exchange acknowledged the collaborative nature of manuscript production, the way different skills supported and enhanced each other. Brendan's work in preparing vellum formed the foundation for everything else. Without properly treated surfaces, even the most skilled scribe could not produce satisfactory results. The recognition of this interdependence strengthened the bonds of community, reminding each monk that his individual labor contributed to collective achievement. The afternoon progressed through its familiar pattern of sustained work, interrupted only by the slow movement of light across the floor and the gradual advancement of text down the page. Colman added line after line to the growing manuscript, his progress measured and consistent, his attention unwavering despite the knowledge that completion approached. The work deserved his full presence regardless of whether this was the first page or the last, and he gave it willingly. By late afternoon, when the light had begun to take on the golden quality that preceded evening, Colman had completed perhaps half of what he estimated would be the final page. Tomorrow, if his calculation proved correct, he would finish the gospel manuscript that had occupied so many months of patient labor. The realization brought a mixture of satisfaction and something like sadness, pride in work accomplished, but also awareness that this particular relationship between text and scribe would soon conclude. The bells for Vespers rang across the monastery grounds, calling him away from his desk toward the church where evening prayer would gather the community once more. He cleaned his quill with extra care, covered his work with gentle attention, and descended the spiral stairs into air that had grown cooler with the approach of evening. The walk to the church carried him through gardens where Brother Diamuid moved among the vegetables, harvesting produce for tomorrow's meals, his bent form silhouetted against the lowering sun. The evening prayers held particular beauty in this light, the church's stone walls glowing warm, the brothers' voices rising together in familiar psalms. Colman felt deeply connected to this community, to the shared rhythms of prayer and work that structured their days, to the common purpose that gave individual efforts their larger meaning. After prayers came the simple meal, bread and cheese and late summer vegetables dressed with oil and vinegar, ale to drink, all consumed in silence while one brother read aloud from a devotional text. After supper, several monks gathered in the garth for conversation before complying. Brother Finian spoke about his plans for the mark illustration, describing the composition he envisioned and the challenges it would present. Young Aidan mentioned that he had reached a particularly moving section in his Saints Lives manuscript, an account of martyrdom that had affected him deeply during copying. These exchanges of experience and reflection helped maintain the community's shared engagement with their work, reminding each scribe that others understood the particular demands and rewards of manuscript production. As darkness settled over the monastery, Colman found himself walking alone near the garden walls, his mind reviewing the day's work and anticipating tomorrow's completion. The gospel manuscript had become such a constant presence in his life that its conclusion would leave a kind of absence, a gap that would eventually be filled by the next commission, the commentary on Paul's epistles that the Welsh monastery had requested. But for now, in this transitional moment between one major work's end and another's beginning, he allowed himself to feel both satisfaction and a gentle melancholy. The stars emerged as full darkness arrived, and Colman made his way to Compline. The final prayers of the day carried him into peaceful tiredness, his voice joining with his brothers in the ancient words that marked another day's conclusion. In his cell afterward, preparing for sleep, he reflected on how the rhythm of monastic life created space for both significant accomplishment and the humility that recognized individual achievement as part of larger, ongoing purposes. Sleep came gently, accompanied by the sound of wind moving through the monastery grounds and the distant rhythm of ocean waves. Tomorrow would bring the completion of months of careful work, the final words of the gospel copied onto vellum that would preserve them for future readers. The thought brought peaceful anticipation rather than anxiety, trust that the work would conclude as it should, in its proper time and manner. The morning of completion arrived with mist hanging low over the monastery grounds, creating an atmosphere both intimate and mysterious. Colman woke to the bells with heightened awareness, knowing that today would mark a significant transition. He dressed in the cool, damp air and made his way through the fog to the church, where candlelight glowed with special warmth against the pervading grayness. After lauds and the morning meal, he climbed the spiral stairs for what might be the last time as the scribe of this particular gospel manuscript. The Scriptorium appeared ethereal in the mist-filtered light, the familiar space transformed by atmospheric conditions into something that felt both ordinary and special. He settled at his desk, uncovered his work, and examined the half-completed final page with a mixture of eagerness and reluctance. Eager to finish well, reluctant to leave behind work that had become such a significant part of his daily life. His quill touched vellum and the copying resumed. The gospel text moved toward its conclusion, Christ's promise to remain with his disciples always, even to the end of the age. These final words carried particular resonance, suggesting that divine presence continued beyond the historical moment being described, extending forward through time to include all who would follow, all who would read these words in manuscripts yet to be created, in places and times impossible to imagine from the perspective of 7th century Ireland. Brother Finian worked at his own desk, conscious that Colman was approaching the completion of his manuscript. Young Aidan occasionally glanced toward the older scribe, aware that he was witnessing a significant moment in the Scriptorium's ongoing life. The three monks worked in companionable silence, each engaged in his own labor, yet connected through shared purpose and mutual respect. The morning advanced through its familiar progression, the mist gradually lifting to reveal the monastery grounds in stages. By mid-morning, when sunlight finally broke through the remaining fog, Colman had added several more lines to the final page. The text was approaching its conclusion, perhaps another hour of work remaining before the gospel would be complete. He paused briefly to flex his fingers and rest his eyes, aware that he wanted these final lines to be copied with the same precision that had characterized all previous work. The bells for sext called them to prayer, and Colman rose from his stool with gratitude for the interruption. The brief devotions provided a natural pause before the final push toward completion, a chance to center himself in prayer before returning to finish what he had begun so many months ago. After prayers, he did not immediately return to the scriptorium, but instead walked briefly in the garth, allowing his mind to settle and his body to stretch before the final session of copying. When he did return to his desk, the light had strengthened considerably. The earlier mist completely dispersed. He settled onto his stool, took up his quill, and resumed copying where he had paused. The gospel text moved through its final sentences, the Great Commission completed, Christ's promise recorded, and then the simple conclusion that marked the narrative's end. Colman's hand moved with deliberate care through these last words, each letter formed with full attention, each stroke of the quill precise and controlled. The final sentence appeared beneath his patient hand, word following word until only one remained. Amen. The affirmation that sealed the text and completed the gospel. He formed the letters slowly, allowing each one its proper space and time. The initial capital A, then M, then E. Finally, in the last stroke of his quill completed the final letter, and the gospel manuscript was finished. Colman set down his quill and sat quietly for a moment, looking at the completed page, feeling the weight of months of labor reaching their natural conclusion. The moment held no drama, only quiet completion. The work was done well, ready to begin its own journey forward through time. Colman sat with his hands resting gently in his lap, his gaze moving slowly across the finished page one final time. The letters stood clear and even, the final word, Amen, marking not an ending but a kind of opening, a doorway through which the gospel's message would continue to travel forward into years and places he could not envision. Outside the scriptorium window, the summer light had reached its fullest brightness, illuminating the monastery grounds with a clarity that made every detail visible. The stone walls warm in the sun, the gardens lush with growth, the distant hills rolling away toward the unseen coast. Brother Finian worked quietly at his own desk, while young Aidan continued his careful copying, their presence a gentle reminder that the work of the scriptorium continued, that other manuscripts were being created even as this one reached completion. Colman lifted the finished page carefully and placed it with the others in the wooden box, adding it to the stack that represented months of patient attention. The manuscript was complete now, ready for binding, ready to become a book that would serve readers for years, perhaps generations. The thought brought him a deep and simple contentment. not pride in personal achievement, but gratitude for the opportunity to participate in something larger than himself, to add his small contribution to the ongoing work of preservation and transmission. He cleaned his quill one final time, wiped his ink-stained fingers on a cloth kept for this purpose, and arranged his desk with the same care he brought to all his tasks. The Scriptorium would be here tomorrow, and there would be other manuscripts to copy, other texts to preserve. The Welsh monastery's commission awaited him, and beyond that, other work he could not yet imagine. The rhythm would continue, prayer and work, rest and renewal, each day offering its gifts while asking for presence and attention in return. Through the window, a bird sang in the apple tree, its voice clear and unhurried in the warm afternoon. Colman listened for a moment, then rose from his stool and descended the spiral stairs, carrying with him the quiet satisfaction of work completed, and the peaceful knowledge that tomorrow would bring its own opportunities for meaningful labor, its own invitation to show up and begin again.